hello to the Midweek webinar. I'm Linda van Tilburg, and today I've got Mmusi Maimane with me. Well, what we're discussing today, the Constitutional Court has recently ruled that Parliament has to change the Electoral Act to include provisions that allow independent candidates to compete in national elections. This decision has been welcomed by many political parties, including Mmusi Maimane, who believe it will change the nature of politics in South Africa and strengthen our democracy. Well, Alec Hogg interviewed Teresa Conradie from Mafala Mukati and Conradie, the legal firm which drove the case, and Herman Mashaba, the former mayor of Johannesburg, last week, who both thought that political changes, big ones, are coming. But what we want to try to probe today, is this the change we need to break the control that the ANC holds over Parliament? And to discuss it with me is Mmusi Maimane. Of course, you know who he is. Mmusi Maimane is the former leader of the DA, and he is going to help us sort of unpack this whole thing. And maybe I should get Mmusi to introduce himself and on what he's doing now and what's happening.
Sure, and good afternoon, everybody. It's my great privilege to be with you, Linda, and certainly looking forward to engaging the conversation as we go today. I certainly, in my current role now, I'm the chief activist and founder of One South Africa movement, and that movement inherently exists to become a grassroots-led movement. We really believe that citizens are best empowered to be able to effect the changes they'd like to see. And having moved from being the former leader of the opposition in Parliament and leader of the DA, this has been a role I've found incredibly fulfilling as you get back to effectively meeting with people. And I really, at best, am married to one wife. I have two beautiful kids and a beautiful wife, might I add, because of my wife, not because of me. But and happy to serve the people of this country in whichever way is best to do that.
Okay, well, I just want to go back to Stuart Lohman, our general manager, to ask him if everything is working, because the whole idea of this is we want to be interactive, we want your questions, and we want to get Mmusi to answer them. We will lead it a little bit, and when we, if I think there's some questions that needs to be asked as a follow-up, we will. So, Stuart.
Thanks, Linda. Always good to be here. Just quickly, before we get going, if you can see Linda and Mmusi on the screen, and there's a nice presentation slide underneath, and hear my voice. There's a little I see the high fives are coming through. That's excellent. Please let us know if this sounds a bit too soft or too loud. We can just adjust the levels, but it sounds okay on my side, but just let me know. As Linda said, we do like to keep the webinars conversational. So we need your input for that. There's a little questions bar on the control panel on the right-hand side. If you put your questions in there, Linda can sort of process them and pass them on to Mmusi as we go through on the discussion. But it all looks good, Linda, so enjoy, guys.
Okay, but while we get people to ask some questions, I ask a couple of them before we get to the constitutional changes. Mmusi, I think we just need to go back a little bit on when you leave the DA, and I know there was press conferences and we've talked about it a lot, but can I phrase it like this? Do you think you can have an impact, or as much an impact, outside of the political system as you had within the system?
Yeah, it's a very good question. First and foremost, I think our history has shown the fact that genuine change often occurs outside of Parliament if you want a societal change. And if you look at global phenomena, you can appreciate that, whether I disagree with his views fundamentally, but President Trump was outside the body politic and effected a change. Fair enough, in a different system, but the change occurred because citizens were tired of institutional politics as they were. The second dynamic is that when you look at the French election, the recent French election, you could see someone like Emmanuel Macron, who, whilst was in the system, felt that a movement from outside the system could effect the change that they needed. When you look at the state of Zimbabwe, if you've tracked to 2007, which is effectively when ZANU-PF lost the elections, a movement for democratic change was the key vehicle of bringing about the change externally. So if you want to, the best way to answer the question is to say, are institutional politics able to reform and bring the changes that we need? If the change you're seeking is simply to change the colors that are represented in Parliament, well, stay within the system and play within the system. But if you genuinely want to see an inclusive South Africa upon which all men and women can work together for their prosperity, then you must appreciate that there are 17 million South Africans who are disengaged politically. 13 million are registered to vote but don't actually vote. And thirdly, the system itself doesn't really desire the required change. So we can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and hope for a different outcome. We need to find a different way. And whilst I worked hard and served in Parliament, I realized that perhaps maybe in the 6 years I was in Parliament, we really were talking about issues that impact the elite. Hardly ever spent time speaking about issues that affect South Africa. It's why today the corrupt still roam the corridors of Parliament. It's why today policy is still in such a way that whatever, it's winners take all. So a majoritarianism view. So I felt that I needed to get back to society, to speak to citizens and say to them, let's form a new coalition outside Parliament to be able to effect the change that we need to see. Because I think in general, citizens are tired of politics and are tired of politicians. And therefore, I've counted it a great privilege. And I strongly believe that given the history of change globally, given the history of change even in our own country, if you think about the ending of apartheid, yes, people like Helen Suzman, who were within the parliamentary process, served an incredible great deed, but actually it was forces outside of that brought change. And the significance of the change we need to see in South Africa isn't just going from black, green, and gold to blue or to red or to whatever. It is a profound societal change. That's what this moment requires. And therefore, it needs a new coalition that is beyond politics, that brings all citizens together to say we need to bring that change. And that's what I'm trying to champion.
You've just mentioned the word coalition. There's a question from Doe Pinar. Well, if you're talking about a coalition, he says, why did you not join Herman Mashaba then?
Because to the point I've just made, South Africa's ballot box has got 48 political parties. Mr. Mashaba will be party number 49, and then we'll add another few, it'll be 50. Doesn't history teach us that we've had to learn this lesson 47 times? If you think the ANC is one of those, that we're trying to bring systemic change in. So I don't really believe that exclusively a party-based system is the only way we're able to change. That's why we worked hard to speak about electoral reform, which is how do we bring communities and independents across? So that's on the one issue. The second dynamic is the combination between Mr. Mashaba and I wasn't just a mere function of a spa in Cape Town and a spa in Joburg, either working together under a franchise. They're two different views. I have a different view about economic reform. I have a different view about societal reform. I have a different view about immigration as an argument. Therefore, it becomes crucial that actually, when you are in that space, don't try and just merge policy because people feel that you should just work together for working together's sake. I'm genuinely wanting to bring change to South Africa. And the change I want to see is that, one, South Africa must change how it elects its own people. That's important. Secondly, we must divorce ourselves from this current political capture that we're experiencing across all parties, and adding another party to that isn't going to be helpful. Thirdly, I think we must reform society so that the way we structure a constituency-based system, because if you don't do that exercise, we are going to be beset with racial tensions for generations to come. Why is it that we live in South Africa where you can look at the Eastern Cape and say that's a predominantly Xhosa province, and go to the KZN and say it's a predominantly Zulu province, and so forth and so forth? Those are old infrastructural issues that we need to reform if we're going to win on the diversity question of what our country is. So really, when I talk about a coalition, we've understood the term only in political terms. We've never understood the term to say, why don't we build a new coalition? Why is business silent in these matters? Why are NGOs and faith-based organizations silent when it comes to some of these issues? Why is it that it would seem that 17 million of those South Africans are disengaged from the conversation about their country? So we have to get back to that, and that's what I'm working hard. It is certainly the harder route to go, but the significant route to go, because I want to give something for my kids to be able to look in the future and say, truly, we've given effect to democratic processes. And so The easy and tempting part would be to start another party or form a coalition with other parties. That's the easy part, but it doesn't change much. History has taught us that.
Well, here's a question that I've been emailed, and I think you might know where this is coming from, who said that, well, if you're eventually elected as an independent candidate in Parliament, you standing up there, I mean, you've got fierce opposition. I mean, you know what an astute politician Cyril Ramaphosa is. And David Mabuza, I mean, I watched him at the ANC conference where he was elected. He outmaneuvered a lot of people. So, you know, how do you stand there as an independent candidate? And this is the question from, as I said, I know you probably know who this is coming from. How are you going to stand up to those people if it sometimes would seem to some people that you couldn't stand up to Helen Zille?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are important in this. You can stand up to an individual, but what the individual relies on is the system that protects them. So President Zuma, it didn't matter whether you could move a motion of no confidence against him. When it was said and done, it was the ANC benches who were able to defend him and protect him when it came to the vote. President Ramaphosa relies on exactly the same model because it's about patronage. It's about the fact that at Nasrec, branches were bought and those branches owe their loyalty to him. And so when he arrives in Parliament, those branches have to defend him, regardless of whether the issue is correct or incorrect. Now, in the light of that, now let's get back to this question of independence and independence. On the first instance of independence, I really believe that we need to form a broader coalition of independents who come to Parliament realizing that they don't firstly represent their party, they represent the citizens who brought them there. Because now suddenly, what would happen in a universe where you said to President Ramaphosa, I think in this instance, you have failed the people of this country and maybe you have violated sections of the Constitution and it enjoins us to then vote you out as parliamentarians. Suddenly that vote is no longer the party has decided that we must defend. Suddenly that vote says, if MP X or MP Y votes not in the interest of the people, then that person is betraying those who voted for them. Then they must get back to explain to the community, I came to vote to defend Jacob Zuma or President Ramaphosa or in economic policy whatsoever. So I think the reformation of the system empowers the voices of the citizens in a much stronger manner. Secondly, party politics are such that even though I as a leader could stand up and say some of the comments that Premier Zille at the time was making were certainly things that I could not agree with and could not stand by. It became then a question of party machinations, as if it wasn't something that affected all South Africans. With the new Electoral Act and electoral reform, suddenly accountability does not lie with now suddenly parties. It lies with the people. And I think you can mobilize society to say, now we need to stand up together to bring about the changes that we need. And then lastly, I think actually the future of this country requires that if you reform where accountability sits, people like President Ramaphosa can't afford to go to Congress and say, I'll buy so many branches. And once those branches are bought, he must be reminded that if people are dissatisfied within his own party from the decisions that were taken, from the branches that were bought, what's to stop another ANC person from now going to stand as an independent in a community? Because suddenly that power of patronage is broken. And therefore, I think to me, the Constitutional Court judgment that took place last week is not only a game changer for the electoral system in the country, it's a game changer for intra-party politics. And it strengthens not only the individual, but ultimately the voice of the community. So I certainly am looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to bringing a whole bunch of South Africans who say, no, we are not just going to vote in Parliament because our loyalty is to the party. We're going to vote in Parliament because it's our loyalties to the people.
So I'm just kind of trying to work out how this is going to work. So, so the Electoral Act needs to be changed, and what we would be heading for is something similar to the Van Zyl-Slabbert report, I think, where you have a mixed system. In other words, you have proportional representation, which we have now, which is, I don't know, what, 50% of the vote, and then we have people who contest seats. But how would it work? And as somebody told me, that the real catch is what percentage of seats will be allocated to individuals and what would be to parties. You know, do you have any idea of what changes could come to the Electoral Act?
Well, I think even if we're working hard to produce a new draft electoral act that we could table to Parliament, and Mr. Lakota has already tabled a draft bill, and I'll communicate more details on that. Suffice to say, I think at a preliminary level, if you went with the Van Zyl-Slabbert report and took the 300-100 phenomena, so 100 being proportional representation and 300 being constituency-based, it is conceivable that the majority of MPs ought to represent a constituency of some sort, and that the remainder then gets allocated on a proportional based system. So parties must in fact contest in whatever communities they come from, represent the people. That is a significant change. Secondly, I think once you have that kind of formulation going into Parliament, it then becomes possible that to form any majority, you would need to be working with a diversity of South Africans. You can't just arrive in Parliament and just simply say, in majoritarianism, I will decide what happens here. And thirdly, I think if a grassroots-based movement was to find resonance with the people on the ground, you could, in a variety of communities, produce candidates who would then come to Parliament to represent those communities. And therefore, that's why I think if you follow our own history, so if you say, what did the UDF as a bad example or a good example, depending on which side of the fence you are, if the UDF worked, it was a coalition of different people. The limitation with the UDF is that it eventually folded or endorsed the ANC, and that became the vehicle. But if you created a UDF type movement across the country, could it be possible that in Parliament, you could be represented by faith-based leaders, by business leaders, by diversity of South Africans, in which instance you really, of those 300 could create a very strong voice in Parliament, and out of them could emerge a strong cabinet, a strong president. All of those variables come into play. So I think that South Africa will undergo not only, as COVID has proven, a period of reformation or a deep reset, as I'd like to call it, but I think the elections are going to be equally so, a deep reset, as we educate voters that the power is now back in their hands.
So do you actually think that one of these individual candidates could become the president in a new system?
Completely, completely. Now the path has been drawn to allow for that to happen, given the right numbers, given the right people representing them in Parliament. And I think actually it would be a dream for South Africa to be led by a president who would understand that their power is derived firstly from the citizens, not from their party. Because the current system as we have it, any president knows that they could literally ignore the citizens, because that becomes a secondary matter, as long as they've got their party intact. That's why when people say to me, who's President Ramaphosa's boss? I say, actually, it's the ANC. To forget what he might say to the citizens. If the ANC moved a resolution to say he's got to expropriate land without compensation, as an argument, I'm not pronouncing on that policy at this point, but if he said that is the position he's taken, he's bound by that. If he said he wanted to, whatever, the current promulgations around even things like quantitative easing, even things around the role of the Reserve Bank, even things around legislation, he's bound by that. Whereas what I'm trying to get at is that political parties' biggest dilemma is that they become dogmatic around ideology and fail the basic test of being able to produce real solutions for people. So when it comes to the question of state-owned enterprises, I may hold the view that we don't need an airline, therefore a part privatization or complete privatization of that might be on the table. But when it comes to healthcare, I'm not convinced that a privatization of the healthcare is a helpful solution, given the fact that the majority of our citizens depend on the state for healthcare. Therefore, in that instance, you need a universal healthcare model. So now you are actually attending to the questions of solutions that are practicable for citizens, rather than instead just being dogmatic around ideology and just simply following the dictates of a party that sometimes become irrelevant or not agile in a world that is fast changing.
Okay, we've got a question here from Glenda from Benoni. Do you think the new ruling will splinter the opposition perhaps further and make it even weaker?
I think the new ruling will splinter the governing party and will splinter party politics, as it were. So I think it's a new game. It's a new game in its entirety. And I think for Linda, if you were to think to yourself now, Benoni could really have someone who would represent Benoni. And people could say, hey, you stand for us. You don't just stand for this party or that party. You represent us. And even along with that, we've gone further in saying we need a pact that sits between the citizens of a particular community and the MP that they put, so that if that pact is broken, then the very same citizens could really apply to the Independent Electoral Commission and request that, frankly, we want to see person Y be removed because that person is no longer serving our interest. That is a crucial objective within a parliamentary constituency-based system, is that actually the citizens can then come back and say, you broke the pact. We agreed that this is what you need to do. Let me, Linda, just to, without trying to make the point too much, today, this afternoon, Parliament will table a budget. Written within our constitutional process is that Parliament budgets are actually, it's a bill, it's a law, it's the appropriations bill. It requires public consultation, but none of us have ever actually been able to give input as to what type of budget we'd like to see. What if community Y that is on the banks of the Vaal River actually want that dam to work in a particular way? Where are their submissions? What if actually community Z in Matatiele needs more healthcare or whatever? How do they express their view? Because those are the views that must be expressed within the budget, so that when it's tabled, it is indeed the people's budget as an appropriation bill. So now instead you go to a party-based system, and frankly, today, whatever Minister Mboweni tables, he could literally say, we're going to take all the money and give it to SAA, for argument's sake. If that was his resolution and the resolution of the ANC, it doesn't matter what opposition they would face. Frankly, if they vote in Parliament in a majoritarianism way to say that's the route we're going to do, well, that is the route they're going to go. So we need to get back to, in fact, what is the voice of the people infused within its own democratic and parliamentary processes.
Okay, I've got a question here, and of course you talked about the economy, so I think, and you know, the budget, well, basically the COVID-19 budget by Tito Mboweni will be in Parliament today. So let's just look at what was happening with COVID-19 and how the government has been handling that. What is your comment on that?
You know, I can only liken COVID-19 to when your house catches fire. If your house catches fire, the first thing that you do is you grab a fire hydrant and you literally shut everything down. Make sure you know what's going on so that you can respond. But once the fire simmers down and you have to rethink about how you rebuild, then you have to say to yourself, which rooms did I want in the first place? How do I protect a fire in another place? The challenge here is that the government's initial action of a hard lockdown was correct. What has happened
you all agreed with that. A lot of politicians agreed with it. Yeah.
But what's happened subsequent to that has been, quite frankly, disappointing. It's disappointing in the sense that the government tells us that they are following scientific evidence, yet given their own prescriptions of that scientific evidence, which is what is the rate of infection, where is the thing spreading, they haven't followed even just that advice alone, because now we're easing regulations contrary to the fact that we are seeing more and more rates of infection. So now my argument is basically this, is that if you treat a crisis, to quote Winston Churchill, as the best opportunity you want, and not waste a good crisis, the question for the government is, what are the 6 priorities that emerge post the crisis? And that's what you start to steer everyone to. And if you don't mind, with your latitude, I'd like to propose a few. The first is, you've been given an opportunity. Now, the first problem that you've got to respond, I think the fight against COVID is a fight against poverty. It's not the fight against the virus. It's a misnomer to say that. The virus is going to be with us for a long time. We have to fight poverty, because then that way we begin to build resilience in our system. Because in 2021, a new airborne disease could be upon us. So you can't just keep locking down the country. You have to decide what you want to do. So the first is, I think we must attend to the question of housing, because our greatest fear is that our people live in conditions that are not helpful to fighting any virus. And secondly, along with that, in truth, the response is that people can't even self-isolate in many of our communities. And because of the congestion that people live under, they end up in a space where the virus can spread like wildfire. So I'm proposing we must attend to the question of housing. We must ensure that rather than not only focusing on the land issue, we must do an aggressive work on housing. Housing creates a micro ecosystem. It ensures that actually people live in dignified housing. And the poor are the ones often, because of a lack of choice in diet, in healthcare, all of those things, suffer the most with lifestyle disease, which is the underlying comorbidities that enhance any virus. So we must deal with that issue. Secondly, I would reform our economy and pick a few sectors. You don't do everything, you pick a few sectors. Say to yourself, what are we doing around mining, as an example? Now, mining might be seen as a sunset industry, but actually it's got micro benefits along the way. The growth of any country's GDP is dependent on whether it can produce more and sell more. That's the basic summation of this issue. Therefore, you must say to yourself, that industry, you are going to put every precaution in it. You are going to make sure that you are going to supply it with a consistent energy. You are going to modernize it as a competitive feature and make sure that ultimately its productivity output is much higher. And then you build the value chain down from there. The third dynamic of this issue is that where do you pick education? The fact of the matter is that that's why we've been in court fighting around this issue, because I think our kids are being asked to arrive at schools as petri dishes that the virus could spread. How do you migrate our learners away from just monologue type teaching where there's a teacher in a class to a much more digitized or blended educational environment? Because that builds the supply chain of the competent citizens you want. And therefore, we have to have been working harder in the last 3 months to say, what online classrooms are we putting? What blended opportunities do we have? What economy are we preparing our kids through? That's about spectrum allocation, all of those issues. Fourthly, I think without doubt, you have to pick tourism and agriculture and say to yourself, we've got to intra-trade as Africa. So the exports that we build around agriculture are going to end up in Zambia, Zimbabwe, SADC areas. How do we make sure that our agricultural model not only exports better within Africa, but also we can create more job opportunities there? And then how do we build intra-tourism? The people are going to be coming to our country. One of our best assets is the fact that this is a beautiful country. Still by far, we've got the best weather, best economic conditions for people to come here, invest, all of those things. So deal with those particular matters. And then lastly, I would argue strongly that in our financial services sector, we have an opportunity not only to stimulate micro enterprise, but to diversify that sector. South Africa needs to invest more in micro enterprise, create a national venture capital so that people can buy into it, but also demonopolize sectors that are monopolized. So that in insurance sectors, there are much more insurance companies that are coming on, financial services, etc. And then when you say to citizens, you come back with that plan and you say, here are the 6 or 7 things we are going to do. You have to pay the sacrifice to make sure we get there. We're giving you a new deal. Here's a vision I have. The vision is one day we don't talk about 30% unemployment, we talk about single-digit unemployment. If that's the new deal, here are the sacrifices we're going to have to do. We're going to have to forego an airline. People, I think, would get behind you on that decision. We are going to cut cabinet and make it much smaller. People will go with you in that decision. We are going to ask kids to stay at home and create blended learning. People will go with you, because if the first response to COVID was born out of fear, this one must be born out of hope. Then you start to adjust your strategy to say, we're going to put our stall on that, because suddenly when someone wants to invest in South Africa, they're not just doing it arbitrarily. They know which sectors you want to go in and they can invest heavily into that. It is time now South Africa articulate what kind of South Africa we want. If we think actually our strategy of managing COVID is to hide until we can go back to the way things were, frankly, the way things were was unjust. It was abnormal. And so to ask all of us to go back to how things were is a misnomer and a betrayal of the future of South Africans.
Well, you said all the things you think South Africans would be prepared to support. What about a wealth tax? Because that seems to be imminent.
Well, you've got to decide what type of taxation you want to put. Now, I'm not one supportive always of a wealth tax, because I think wealthy South Africans in this country are taxed significantly. I think that we've got to think about perhaps maybe a redress tax that we put, that is immediate, that is short term, that puts an intervention, because actually what you want is to create an environment where people can move up the wealth curve. So if you created a particular tax model, whether that would build a fund that is either, I call it a jobs and justice fund, where people can make a contribution to it, where citizens could have shareholding into it, so the private sector would have shareholding, the state would have shareholding in it, and that could be used as a disbursement of a share ownership to many citizens. That's ideal. But frankly, I think that is a short-term intervention. What you rather want is to stimulate philanthropy and help people be able to make more money because they contribute to the fiscus. So wealth tax is already in some ways on the table. We've got to think about a different tax model. And one of the things is, I was wondering whether, rather than talking about EWC as an easy intervention, rather than create a short-term land tax as an example, so that you build a fund, and rather, because divvying up the land is not helpful, but creating a fund upon which it can help stimulate, particularly black farmers, to enter into the economic space, could be a very key intervention that you put as the future of this country.
Okay, well, that's an interesting one that I think people would like to discuss. There are a lot of questions from people that are coming in are about the constitutional changes or the changes to the Electoral Act. But there's one that I thought we should cover on the economy. Renata, there's no surname, are you positive about the future of South Africa? Do you think the economy will improve, and why?
I think it depends entirely on the decisions that we make in the next while. If we don't, if we make decisions that make us go back to where we were, then where we were was a declining GDP, lower levels of investment into this country, and an increasing level of unemployment. In which instance, I think South Africa will face some very difficult days ahead. But I think if we make quality decisions, if we use this crisis to our benefit, the best days of South Africa are ahead, simply on the following reasons. There is a global, our currency is at the weakest it's ever been. Now, the question that we've got to use is, how do we use that, actually? How do we deliberately use that for our own benefit? On two accounts. One, our mineral exports can become key in this particular instance, because suddenly now you are trading against a fairly weak currency. Two, it is unlikely that you are going to import shoes. I love shoes. I have more shoes than my wife, just as a sideline issue. But
that's unusual.
I am, as a black man, I think black people will understand this issue. No.
Okay, yeah, you're probably right. It's a white women's issue. We love shoes.
Yeah, but when it's said and done, if we are going to stimulate manufacturing, we can pick certain items of clothing that we can make domestically, because it's not going to be helpful to import shoes from Italy or wherever else. We have to make them here and modernize that sector. So a company like John Drake here in South Africa is a very good example of what could happen in this regard when we begin to make our own shoes, our own garments, because it's just, it's common sense. The third dynamic is that when it looks at palladium as an example, which is a resource which is going to be needed in a lot of battery technology going forward.
Oh yeah.
Now that it's scarce here, but we are close to it here. So if South Africa didn't think Eskom is just existing to provide energy just to South Africa, but rather to the whole SADC region, it's quicker for us to get to those countries. It's quicker for us to mine much more effectively, and it's more important for us to export that. So that's an opportunity that sits. So if South Africa could become just that hub of being able to say, within where we sit, we are well positioned, we've got the best legal system, and we have the best opportunities around technology to be able to become the export hub on minerals, on agriculture, but also the domestic production levels are going to have to be higher simply because we cannot import with ease. Then I think South Africa's future is bright. And I really think this could be Africa's decade, because lastly, there is a big debate happening in economic circles about the population dividend, which is What do you do now, suddenly with 1.2 billion people by 2040, as is projected? Now, it's a very important question because the working age globally will be here in Africa. So in that instance, can we maximize the population dividend? If we fail that exercise, just on the basis of frictional cost alone and disease management, we are going to face some difficult problems when more citizens cannot move into the middle class. And what Africa's sole objective, Africa now in general as a continent, the only question that must be before us is how do we move 300 million citizens from poverty to the middle class? That is the only question. That's the question we have to answer. And I think if we think like that and we say, how are we going to do it? And begin to find interventions that help us do it, Africa's best days are ahead of it.
Well, that's very positive. The questions are sort of, again, more about the changes that would be coming. First of all, Robert Mitchell says, sounds like Mmusi is very similar in his ideas to Herman Mashaba. Is this true? But you've explained that, but you can say that, explain how yours are different. And there's a more technical question. How many parliamentarians can be elected? Surely there's not enough space in parliament for every city and town to have a representative. Can we start with Herman Mashaba again? Is your policy similar to Herman Mashaba?
Well, I certainly, when I think about some of the broad themes of the problems in this country, there might be some similarity. But when I think about some of the diagnosis and the genuine solutions on the table, as I said, to me, the key distinctives are around party and how a party in fact works. Secondly, how do we deal with the question of immigration? I'll take a totally different stance. I would argue the case
how's
that,
the difference? Can you
say,
just
for
say
example,
how's your case?
Well, I can't pronounce on their policy position, but on a broad spectrum, I certainly think that the sooner we trade together as amongst Africa within the SADC region, that's key. So I don't subscribe to a theory that says, for example, in the broad slogan, put South Africans first, as if that's to the exclusion of any other citizen who's coming. I think that could be quite a position that I don't subscribe to. I hold the view that says that, of course, you must deal with proper immigration process, but when it's said and done, it's actually, how do we deal with Africa? This is, to me, an exciting opportunity. It's an opportunity we mustn't fear. We must understand that the sooner we trade together as Africans, there's an incredible opportunity for the population boom, the resource boom. If we deal with governance, make sure dictators are removed and democratic principles are upheld. That's why I'm looking forward to the elections in Malawi. I'm looking forward to, and I'm making the call to say the opposition leader in Tanzania must be released, and Zito Kabwe, who's been arrested illegally. South Africa must take its role here. Zimbabwe, what's taking place there is complete madness. This is a dictator who's risen up, Mnangagwa, and now MPs cannot function. We must be strong on those issues. So on Africa and immigration, that's a challenge. On social justice and an inclusive economy, I think that there's some policy nuanced issues that we need to look at. I certainly am pro perhaps a social market system on the table, not a free capitalist model. I think that part of the problem is that if you deal just with capitalism that is without a sense of conscious, I mean, I think even people like Larry Fink have written extensively on how we reform capitalism in a way that it doesn't look at profit just as a bottom line, but how does it add value to citizens in its broadest terms? So I think there are many policy areas that I think if you don't negotiate those, you might end up with a challenge, let alone the party issue. But
okay, so how do we deal? Do we have this massive parliament space for every city have a representative, or do we stick to the same number? How do we accommodate this whole idea of of every, maybe all these representatives coming with individual points of view?
One, I think you can't have, this is democracy at the end of the day. It's not, so we have to keep the same number of MPs, 400. That wasn't, the constitution didn't pronounce to say the number of parliament must be reformed. But what you then start to do is that I think an appropriate body, either the IEC, I'm not always confident about the demarcation board. I've dealt with them historically and I've seen how that body can be captured in no different to how perhaps maybe the National Party did it to deal with gerrymandering in and of itself. So you've got to ensure that you build constituencies, and I would argue that if South Africa was to be reduced to about 66 odd or 60 odd constituencies, because in each constituency, you don't have to have one MP come from there. So like a big city like Johannesburg surely cannot be represented by the same number of people as Kurumane would. The population numbers are not the same. So you would need more MPs in urbanized, concentrated, so there'd be effectively more MPs from big concentrated cities, Gauteng, Western Cape, KZN, and then the rural population you'd create fewer MPs coming from there, but the total number would be 300, and then the 100 being in proportional representation. At least that's how the system is built to work, if I could say that.
So there's now 600. So are you thinking about 300 elected and 300 proportional? According to
300, 100.
300,
so 301. So you still keep 400 seats in parliament. 300 are directly elected from a constituency-based system, and the 100 will be retained in a proportional representative system. And the win behind that is that, take for example, Khoisan, the First Nation South Africans.
Yes.
How do they get represented in parliament? They may not be able to muster the sufficient numbers in any respective constituency to get representation, but they could, through a proportional representative model, to get an MP to represent their interest. And I think in our democratic consensus, it's a very helpful tool to have all the diversity of our people represented in parliament.
Okay, well, the questions that I've seen repeat themselves. So what I'm going to do is, well, I just want to remind everybody that all the webinars go on YouTube, the YouTube channel. Mmusi, if you also want to put it on, well, there's a link there, and everybody would know, you know, if they want to watch it again or hear what Mmusi has to say. Mmusi, we're sort of getting towards the end. Would you like an end message just to tell us where you are, where you're heading, where South Africa is heading?
Look, I'm driven fundamentally by a deep passion for our nation. I think the best days of South Africa are ahead of it. I really believe that. I think that South Africans have to confront their day of reckoning. All of us must reevaluate the fact that we've undergone liberation. You cannot be discussing liberation parties today, because then you have to answer the question, what are they liberating us from? Can liberation liberate people from class or race? We've now got to get through, in fact, that we can no longer rely on parties that depend on race as a constituency. So in other words, you can't say there's a party for blacks and a party for whites and a party for Afrikaans South Africans and a party for English South Africans. It's not helpful. That our divisions are also geographic, in that we've got a South Africa for the wealthy and a South Africa for the poor. We've got a healthcare for the wealthy and one for the poor, and an education system for likewise, a bit like Argentina. So when I set out to say, how do we build one South Africa? It has to confront the challenges that say, how do we break down those divisions? So what Mmusi Maimane is about is that one day it would be possible that, in fact, we can not only break down the spatial divides of our country by making sure that more and more citizens can live in integrated spaces, that the movement will always represent all citizens, black, white, Indian, colored, and all the races of this country, that the movement that we build exists to say that we'll build an economic model upon which all people will prosper together. And you do that by stimulating a very strong, around two things. One, build an education platform upon which everybody can get an equitable education, because it's equality in the entrance. The outputs you cannot control, but you can control equality of education. It cannot be that the circumstances of your birth determine where you're going. And because we drive activism, I'm busy at the moment building, hopefully what will be soon, the biggest classroom in the country, where more and more learners can participate digitally in a blended learning environment upon which everybody can get access to education. We believe in entrepreneurship, and that's why I'm wanting to fight harder about making sure that we have this national venture capital that will allow more people to derive benefit from it, but build an education system. That we fought hard for electoral reform, but what we want to do is build rather more a wealth transfer mechanism, an asset transfer mechanism upon which all citizens have got something to transfer to future generations, and that's around title and about some form of shareholder ownership. And if we can achieve that and be future focused as a country, we can make sure everyone participates technologically, we manage disease better, and we can look after our climate. So Mmusi Maimane is building that South Africa, that one South Africa. And that's what I'm wanting to achieve, and that's what I'm working towards. And so there's hope. And I think all citizens, even the people who are listening here, I'm saying to them, be part of a move, be active where you're at, be active where you are at. Because if we lose activism as a country, it's why state capture occurs and nothing happens as a result of that. Because we've sat as spectators and be entertained from time to time and be saddened the majority of the time. But at the end of the day, it's the future of the country that was looted, and no one has paid a consequence for it. So how do we, as citizens, become active in not only our political system, but in our businesses, in our communities, in our families? You know, lastly, Linda, you know, we talked today about gender-based violence as the heinous crime and scourge on the soul of our country that is. And we forget that in many ways we've asked young boys to raise themselves. We forget that what apartheid said is that it said, I'm going to take your father away from you and let them work elsewhere. And I'm going to take your mother away from you and let them work elsewhere. What we've got to do is say to ourselves, how do we restore that as a society to make sure one day actually families can remain together? Whatever the configuration of it is, you can't have these mining towns that separate families. They don't help in the role modeling process. The value I can play to my son is to be here to transfer values to him and assist him so that he grows up to be an honorable South African who honors women. So the reformation of our society isn't just a question of politics. It is a question of all of us as a society, and all of us must be a part of a response to that question and be better allies to our country. So I'm committed to that process, and I think it requires strong leadership. No longer can it be said that we must hate each other across gender lines, but also across racial lines, that one day when I look at a white South African or a black South African, we must be proud. We must celebrate the diversity of our nation, but no one should ever be feared that they are less of a human being because of the color of their skin. And if today any citizen is feeling like that, that cannot be acceptable. And so I stand on the side of those who say, let's build a country for our future and let's work together.
I didn't know I said we're gonna end this now, but then suddenly I think we mentioned wealth tax. That touched a nerve. I've got somebody who just talks about a wealth tax and has a suggestion. Instead of that, rather create a culture and make it sexy or cool of natural distribution of wealth through philanthropic behavior without chasing the entrepreneurs and wealth away, which could lead to massive job losses. He says, we as warm, caring South Africans have shown our Ubuntu, and this is AJ, by the way, and mettle during CV19 with active passive donations. So what is your response to that? And somebody else said, can we have a quick view on Black empowerment, what your view is on those two issues, please?
Well, as I've made my remarks on the wealth tax, as I said, I think we have a progressive tax system, and wealthy South Africans pay a significant proportion of their wealth into the coffers. So I think that there is some form already built into that. If you are talking about a redress test, that's a completely different discussion. And I think we mustn't marry the two. We must talk about one type of tax that if you created some form of understanding that we have a history as a country, and that history requires us to create some form of justice and a pool of money that is available for development of our country, then we must decide how we raise that capital quickly, but on a permanent basis so that more and more people can participate and benefit from it. On the BBBEE, I've been outspoken on it. I think the principle is redress, not the policy position. The policy that has been taken by this particular government depends on making sure that a few group of people can benefit through that. So it's genuinely not able to include future generations. The biggest redress mechanism that we can put is about how do we put assets in the hands of South Africans who didn't have assets before. So imagine if rather than simply saying you want to create this policy that creates an additional compliance level, take state-owned enterprises, break them up and say South Africans can become shareholders in those state-owned enterprises. Suddenly, Mrs. Maimane, who my mother, who grew up in Soweto in Dobsonville, was dispossessed, suddenly has got a share ownership that she can transfer to future generations. That suddenly creates a wealth transfer progressively. What about the creating the form of redress tax that creates this jobs and justice tax? There are fund that will be used to not only educate citizens but create enterprise development along way, so that you create more and more businesses, not less. How do we use some of that to empower citizens so that they are making choices to people who say, if you're not looking just at profit but the development of communities as an incentive mechanism for people to be able to trade with you, there are some inbuilt benefits in that. So I would reorganize the entire BBB model, adopt one that's simpler for people to comply with, but that ensures that justice is achieved through a fund that everyone can manage, so that we build development. And I think that's the focus. It's about the future, not. So that's what I want to try and get to. And to be honest with you, Linda, I know many citizens, particularly white citizens, feel like there's this punitive moment in this country. I think it's in the interest of all of us. My wife is a white South African. My kids are mixed race. My point is not to be punitive to any particular race. It's to say, collectively, it is in our interest to address the injustices that were committed against Black South Africans. You don't need to be Black to say that. You have to just be someone who says, actually, it makes common sense that where there was an injustice, let's correct it, but together we can do that. So imagine if you created a fund that had some private sector directorship and public sector directorship that said, you know what, we're going to fight like anything to make sure that if there are entrepreneurs who need some funding, we can assist those. If there are kids who don't have proper education and happen to be Black, this fund is going to be designed for the particular purpose of addressing that injustice. Suddenly you begin to rewrite the wrongs of the past so that one day my kids who are mixed race don't ever have to account for their race, but can celebrate it as a function of diversity. It takes all of us. So to me, when I think about legislation like BBBEE, I think I would scrap it, and I've said it before, and I would look at a different model of jobs and the justice that says, how do we intervene in this space to address historical injustices collectively as a citizen?
Mmusi Maimane, thank you so much. And by the way, somebody just sent me a message, Robert Mitchell, if he doesn't mind me reading it. He says, thank you, Mmusi for president.
That is so generous of Robert. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for participating, and we'll definitely watch what's going to happen and see how it pans out. And in future, we'll definitely have you on again if you know these big changes are coming. And best of luck in these times. And you know, stay healthy, take care. And thank you everybody for joining. Next week, I've got Mox de Prier on and Pierre de Vos, and we're going to talk about the Zondo Commission restarting, and it's all going to be about state capture and what's happening and are the right people getting arrested. So. Join me then. And for this week, thank you so much, Mmusi. Thank you so much, Stuart, for organizing this and for people who joined. And see you next week. Thanks, Mmusi. Bye.